Okay. Hello and welcome to the second session in our series of in the series of our theory workshop, really, which I am conducting along with Sanford Quinter, Viktoria Luisa Barbo, and Marina Rodriguez das Neves. Today we have a session which I think is going to be a very interesting one. The title is "Living in Our Filth: A Conversation about Design in a World of Novel Ecosystems." I'm delighted that Viktoria will be hosting this today. Viktoria is somebody I think with a great future, and it's wonderful to have her as a colleague, but also wonderful to be able to introduce her as the person chairing the session. Welcome, Viktoria.
Thank you so much, Neil, and welcome to everyone that is joining us today on YouTube, but especially thank you to all the participants of the workshop and our guests today. We are really delighted to have everyone here. And so our workshop really aims to look at forgotten and ignored ideas that are kind of re-entering our consciousness. And so today I thought I will share something that has kind of been of my interest. I'll share my screen just to kind of give an introduction. So I want to bring to our attention today something that has been left over or has been ignored, the unseen worlds that have been around us and that are, still part of our presumably so structured modern world. And much of the ideas that we will hear about or that we share are not new ones, but they are part of a long list of thinkers that have been around for a while and new ones that are joining and reconnecting. So why living in our filth? And what does that mean anyways? What we see as dead and unworthy byproducts are often the metabolic gift for other species, giving opportunity to other and novel ecosystems emerging around us in our human habitation. If good or bad, they are always around us. So today we will discuss the emergence of these novel ecosystems in connection with the built environment, but also illuminate the importance of ecological thinking in design and architecture. And for that, I'm very delighted to be joined by a group of amazing people, Alexandra Yeshke, Oliver Kellhammer, Adam and Mendel of FutureEcologies, and of course, Neil Leach, Marina and Sanford Quinter that will join the conversation as well. But let me introduce you to our guests. Alexandra Yeshke joins us from Europe today. She's an architect and assistant professor of architecture and sustainable design at the University of Texas at Austin. Born and raised in Poland, she holds a Doctor of Design degree from the Harvard School of Design and an AA diploma from the Architectural Association in London. And she just co-authored the latest Log 51, sorry, I hold it upside down, Excursions in the Ecosphere with Sanford Quinter and Bruce Mao, who will be hosting a special event as part of this workshop tomorrow. So tune in. And then we have Adam Huggins and Mendel Solsky from FutureEcologies, a beautiful podcast telling the entangled stories of human and non-human life in the form of woven tapestry of immersive soundscapes. Mendel, in his own words, is a recovering industrial designer, amateur mushroom nerd, and garden variety dork. Adam is a musician and practitioner of ecological restoration and works for the Galliano Conservancy on Galliano Island in British Columbia. And last but not least, Oliver Kellhammer. He's an ecological artist, educator, activist, and writer. Through his botanical intervention and public art projects, he seeks to demonstrate nature's surprising ability to recover from damage. His work facilitates the processes of environmental regeneration by engaging the botanical and social political underpinnings of the landscape. His work continues to evolve and has taken many forms. And we will hear from him a little bit more about this fantastic work later. He's also an assistant professor in sustainable systems at Parsons and lives between New York and rural British Columbia, and as I heard, is currently in Massachusetts. So before we start our conversation, I will start with a small provocation to kind of get everyone in the mood for thinking. Living in our filth, a meditation. Who is this I and what is this body? Let me start small. At the microbiological level, my body consists of billions of molecules. Cells piled upon cells are filling my body with action and life. I am the many, and the many are me. I'm a diverse population of cohabiting cells. As much as half of all the biological matter in your body is actually not human. Genome, virome, and microbiome compose a woven fabric of microscopic life that occupies almost every corner of this me. My body, just like your body, loses and replaces all its cells during the next 7-year cycle, creating and killing, ingesting and excreting little pieces of life day in and day out. The me of 7 years ago was composed of different stuff than the me today. All life forms, including you and me, are in fact processes, not things. They are systems through which matter is continuously passing. All living bodies are embedded in a vast circuit of connection and action that stretches far beyond the provincial realm of the humanly perceivable. So, am I landscape, or is landscape becoming me? Against chaos. For the continuation of this vibrant circuit, life requires energy. Organisms extract this energy out of their surroundings in the form of food and integrate it into their own reservoir to withstand the drag of their surroundings towards entropy, towards chaos. We all gotta eat. Organisms are caught up in a constant process of ingesting other life. I eat a carrot, and with it, the previously absorbed solar energy. All energy ultimately comes from the sun. Life creates cascades of absorption and excretion and exchanging matter across the field. Organisms organize themselves into ecological systems, forming intricate webs of manifold interaction with overlapping elements. So I quote Alfred North Whitehead, "The boundary between bodies and environments is rather blurred." He says, "When we consider the question with microscopic accuracy, there is no definite boundary to determine where the body begins and external nature ends. There is somehow a unity of the body with the environment." And this distinction between organisms and their environment, interior and exterior states, is not one of distinct lines, but rather ones of degrees of separation. We are all embedded in this large field of energy and complex relationships, a world of process and creative advance. And this is the beautifully entangled world of organisms and life that is among us and inside of us. Take a deep breath. This would not have been possible 3 billion years ago. Only with the special ability of early life forms to convert the energy from the sun into oxygen, the atmosphere endowed landscapes with the ability to sustain complex multicellular life. Plants continue to be the other half of our breath. Every human in-breath is a botanical out-breath. We depend on our vegetal companions. This cross-species connection is just a singular thread within the vast web of adjoining life forms. In fact, there's an entire trail of organisms who cohabit with us in our homes or inhabit entire landscapes shaped by human action. Previously unseen species and ecosystems emerge from the cracks produced by human life. We call these novel ecosystems. Plastic-eating bacteria, treasured white truffles, matsutake mushrooms with their irresistible allure emerge out of the same cracks of human habitation as novel viruses like COVID-19 and heat-resistant fungi with the potential to significantly harm the human body. So you ask, why would I care about all of this as a designer and an architect? Why not? Our actions have consequences. We try to push the natural frenzy of the environment outward by drawing arbitrary lines of separation in a pursuit for simplification. We design hermetically sealed capsules that are so-called green for habitation and declare war on water, fire, and other organisms. Instead of integrating these natural processes, we delay and dislocate them, resulting in unforeseen and often devastating consequences down the line. The water and fire crises in the southern plateau of California, Arizona, Nevada are just a few of many dooming examples. We have driven our global order from international connection to international interdependence. At the same time, we have removed natural and human-made buffers from ecological, geopolitical, and financial structures in order to run on a more efficient short-term schedule. And we have violently pushed our ever-expanding cities and industrial complexes into the vulnerable landscapes for supposedly more and faster profit. All of this is leaving a turbulent slipstream behind. But nature does not and will not understand the human concept of control. Nature keeps evolving alongside us and inside of us. So instead of damaging more connective tissue of the external organs, the geophysiology, that is a term invented by James Lovelock, these organs that afford human life on this planet and supply us with the air that we breathe and the food that we eat and the temperature for our bodies to subsist within, it might be in the interests of designers and architects who have specifically indicated an interest in spatial organization to rethink and reclaim these severed relationships with the environment, with nature. Maybe we should start thinking like viruses or microorganisms who co-create in symbiosis together with others, but they don't kill their external organs because it is in their interest to pursue the trajectory of their own lives. We, as architects and designers, can also learn to co-create with and within the landscapes that constitute our external organs. We can learn from the immense potentiality of life on this planet and become better ancestors to the following generations of life. Because as we change the worldview, we might be able to help change the world viewed. So welcome everyone to a conversation about novel ecosystems and ecology. And I'm very delighted to welcome our guests and all participants. So I will unshare my screen and start asking a few questions. So thank you guys. Sorry, I have to admit all the other remaining participants very quick. But I want to start with a question to Aleksandra. So your work has been specifically focused on the vegetal realm, the potential of plants to inform the way we think and design. So what do you think, or what is for you the special connection we have to plants? What can we learn as architects and designers? And I know this is a big question, but what have you learned? What have you learned on your journey from plants?
Viktoria, it's a massive question. Thank you. First of all, I wanted to thank Sanford and Friends. That means Sanford and Neil Leach and Viktoria and Marina for having me, well, again, on this platform. It's really a pleasure to be able to have this extended kind of fragmented conversation. Now, God, how to answer this question? So I will start by saying that, you know, when I was a student, I was really fascinated by plant structures. So in the strictly biomimetic sense, which I think many of us went through that fascination and continue to look at plants in that way. That was a while ago. And then I started then to be really interested in looking at how we actually treat plants, how we look at vegetation and how we relate to it in order to understand the kind of hidden paradoxes of our own human society and human culture. And initially I did that when I was writing my doctoral dissertation. Surprisingly for you, probably, I ended up looking at plants when I was studying building codes and financial incentives that actually define how we think about sustainability and how we practice it. And at the very end of my research, I asked myself, well, how does the code actually relate to plants? What does it allow us to do? And I very quickly realized that it actually was either completely silent about plants or prohibitory. So you were either not allowed to get them anywhere near building, or they were not defined. And that's even worse, because when you don't define something, you don't norm it, it just does not exist. And that made me feel really curious about it. And I'm talking about use of plants in very instrumental ways. So at a very basic level, talking about, water purification, air purification, you name it, shading, etc., insulation. And then a couple of years ago, I started looking again at plants as some kind of a signaling device to understand more about our own culture by studying greenhouses and botanical conservatories. This is something I've been doing and I'm still doing. And now, of course, I'm fascinated by, plants in many ways. They distributed and fractal intelligence, something that I've been studying a lot now, their capacity to communicate and collaborate using processes and devices, systems that go from subterranean fungal webs to chemical signaling, et cetera, by their capacity to share and generate more than they need to actually support other forms of light, which actually constitute, of course, a very small fracture of fractions or of biomass, but still all these capacities are incredible. Their capacity to adopt and evolve with the environment. I'm interested in all of these processes, but still, I think what I want to emphasize is that I think we are at a point where we've been through the biomimetic turn for long enough that I think it's no longer enough to learn from plants. I think we need to make a step kind of backwards and learn even more about plants. And I know that my Oliver and Adam and Mendel, of course, do that all the time, but I think architects don't actually do that enough. And I think learning from plants is great, but the expression, at least to my mind, really emphasizes an instrumental attitude, the desire to kind of extract the knowledge that we lack, finding solutions that we need. And of course, that learning makes think of biomimicry. And yet plants are so much more than a model. I mean, plants are ground. Plants are, as Viktoria beautifully described, are breath. Plants are nourishment, although most of the time we think of produce rather than plant when we think about food. But even then, we think about, what's less obvious is, of course, that plants are also companions and underestimated companions. Plants are, of course, pleasure and wisdom. And last, but not, as I said before, but really last, they are a model. And how can we not pay attention to them as architects? And yet we don't. I think each of these issues in itself is worth attention of designers and architects. And, architects are people who re-engineer the biosphere constantly. And considering that plant biomass constitutes 82% of the biomass, we constantly re-engineering these forms of life in some way. Plants are ground. We constantly affect ground, and in all senses, plants are air. We deal with not only trapping air in buildings and redefining, how it circulates, but we also affected, of course, by every single material choice we make just because of manufacturing. Even if we think about nourishment, food, which normally architects don't consider as their field, I think we should be thinking more and more about edible plants as landscapes, which is something that very few or select landscape architects do. And I think we should be really looking at what they're doing. And one other thing, if you think about plants as wisdom, well, we need a lot of it, but unfortunately, we have banned it from our modern society. So we no longer have shamans to guide us. I think we should think about that. So I think that we really definitely need to fundamentally reform our attitude towards plants and look into the vegetable realm, as more than a minefield or mine of solutions and ideas, but really as a sort of wisdom of the elders, because they are our natural elders. And one last thing that I wanted to mention, even when we think about the issue of ground, which is something that I've been thinking a lot recently, it's just such a complex concept, both theoretically, philosophically, but also in pragmatic terms. I mean, soil is in part, of course, made by plants, and ground is not just a plane, it's a thick transitional zone. It's something that defines our perception and our existence in so many different ways. And even if you think about the acoustic realm, although plants don't vocalize, if you talk to any acoustic or ecologist, such as I'm sure Bernie Krauser, but David Monaki, who I personally talked about it with, he will tell you that plants actually are really responsible for modulating the acoustics that are, or the vocalizations that are emitted by animals. So they're not maybe active participants, but they still really shape our environment in so many incredible ways. So why is it important? Just because plants just make the environment. I think that architects really need to open their minds to that part of the environment. So that's just to kind of start, and I'm sure some of these topics, hopefully we can talk about them more later, but thank you for your question, Viktoria.
No, thank you. And I think that's a really good segue to have Oliver maybe talk about his work, because he's working as an ecological artist, educator, and activist. And Oliver, you've worked with novel and even rural ecologies, but ecologies in general, so species across the board. Some of your projects have even gone back to the future and have deployed living fossil ecologies. So yeah, you combine very rigorous research with art and activism at the same time. And yeah, I would just like to know how you can tell us a little bit about your work, but also how you got started with something like that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Viktoria. The introductory questions are so great, because there's this whole idea of the body and also of the sort of vegetative realm and the connections between the kind of, there's a lack of separation between the self and other, right? So my father worked in a factory when I was a kid, a styrofoam factory, and he came home and he smelled like plastic. So my earliest memories were sort of imbricated in the smell of synthetic, petroleum-based material. For me, even though I grew up in Canada, nature was like, to me, lots of factories and oil refineries, which I saw out my bedroom window. I didn't really live in the iconic nature that one associates with Canada, of like these supposedly pristine spaces. So for me, the kind of rural, which we should explain is sort of ruined landscapes or post-industrial landscapes, is basically home. So I became very interested in that at an early age. Is it okay if I share my screen just briefly? I just want to just,
yeah, please.
So I'm more of a visual guy, so maybe I'll just, all right, so let me just see if I can do this. Okay, so let's play. Okay, so can you all see this picture of the doves? So this is just taken recently by the East River, where I live quite close to it in New York. These doves seem to be feeding on this piece of styrofoam, and in a way, I think I'm part styrofoam also. So I have a kind of strange affinity for these kind of spaces. So going with the theme, I mean, literally these plants are growing out of our own waste. And as Mike Davis once said in Dead Cities, the built environment really is slow release fertilizer, and basically so are we, and so is much of our kind of industrial process. And even things like automobiles are possibly subsumed by things like mosses, given the right conditions. So everything is basically food for the botanical the sort of microbiological. We've all experienced these spaces, these kind of ruderal spaces, these interstitial spaces. So most of you have maybe seen this film from the Soviet Union in the 70s. This is Stalker. So the ruderal space becomes a space of emancipation. Like it's a place where magic can happen because it's sort of unenclosed in the Marxian sense. And that includes ecologically. There's a lot of interesting processes that go on here, which I've been studying for most of my life. Also, in game design, you'll see a lot of these spaces as kind of backdrops for gaming. So they represent a kind of visual or optical subconscious. So when you're in these spaces, you start to see these processes, which are really, really interesting. Yes, there's disturbance, but then there's this like nature 2.0 thing that happens, and they reassemble and recombine, indigenous and migrant species in very, very interesting ways, which we've been calling hyperecologies. So I've been studying these for quite a while. So these kind of industrial spaces, the Northeast, where I am now, is like full of these kind of abandoned industrial spaces. And you'll start to find these very interesting ecosystems, which are, I would argue, quite biodiverse and worth paying attention to and worth saving in many cases in terms of by just leaving them alone. This is a very toxic site in Troy, New York, Superfund site, and yet it's got this verdant vegetation growing out of the abandoned factories. This is Robinia, which is a common species in the ruderal again. So the built environment is forming these kind of microclimates for these novel assemblages and novel ecosystems. So I do these kind of field trips as an artistic practice into these zones and kind of do biodiversity surveys, broken parking lots from gas stations. This is in Portland. There was a very, very toxic site on the Willamette River. And I'm also very interested in the human element of these spaces. So because they're sort of unenclosed spaces, the human beings who exist within these spaces or use these spaces, they start to practice things, commoning activities. And so this is in Vancouver some years ago in a vacant area where people were living in these concrete tubes. So as designers, as kind of like designers, everyday designers, quotidian designers, people are making very novel use of these spaces. Many of you will be familiar with the Tempelhof airport in Berlin. These are just these kind of ad hoc spaces that people design themselves, and I call these open source landscapes, right? So not only do non-human organisms arrange themselves in novel ways, so does human. So this is just a place that doesn't go through the traditional planning process and power relationships that's on the periphery of this kind of ruderal landscape, which is a disused airport. And of course, the processes themselves are worth looking at. So this is a tree growing through pavement. So, a fossil fuel-based material, like everything wrong with this material, but yet it's being subsumed by the botanical. There's new geomorphological processes that I'm studying. This is like old electrical cable that's been burned by homeless people and turned into a new kind of mineral. They're salvaging the copper, but the electrical insulation, the metal on the outside remains. So it's a new kind of fossil. New soils, very, very complicated chemical processes, many of them toxic to human life, but plants and fungi are forming these new assemblages. This is a very, very toxic site, but yet it's well vegetated. So when we look at these processes, looking at the built environment, we start to see novel processes of succession. So here's a parking lot. You can see sort of fungi and cyanobacteria, the sort of dark staining, and then it progresses into mosses, then grasses, then sort of emergent forest, trees, in this case a birch and a little pine, just by disuse. So going back to the theme of entropy, as soon as we stop maintaining the built environment, it turns into a slow kind of starting gun, in a sense, for successional processes. And I'm fascinated by these as a designer. This is an older site. This is an emergent forest. So very, very well wooded environment on an abandoned factory. Urban savannas, and many, many species use these sites. So if you spend a lot of time in there, this is a woodpecker called the flicker that's eating the ants that live under concrete. It's an ant specialist, so that it occupies these zones. Vultures, like the roadkill, chimney swifts nest inside chimneys. These are very common in the Northeast. And this is a type of snail, which was the first sighting in North America that I found in Troy. Apparently a very rare snail, but ruderal spaces contain high biodiversity because we ignore them, we leave them alone. The absence of the human makes them actually more ecologically productive. Rare stag beetle, also from the same site. And this is Berlin again. This is a European kestrel on the abandoned airport, which is actually one of the best places for raptors in the city. So in terms of my work, I've been at this for many, many years. In the early 80s, I worked with a site in downtown Toronto, where I'm from. And this neighborhood was contaminated with lead, which is, as you know, is a potent neurotoxin. And it's also a food justice issue. So I proceeded to try to bioremediate the land with buckwheat, which is a metal accumulating plant. So this was like, I think 86 or something. The piece was called Eat and Get Lead. And then later, I started thinking about what happens if we don't do anything? Like, what are the limits of intervention? And I thought, what can I not do? Which is kind of a Buddhist approach to the land. So I actually created weed sanctuaries, which upset people because Toronto had a very draconian anti-weed policy. So I created these kind of defended spaces where weeds could just be weeds and not be cut down, which caused a huge furor. So these were kind of like negative interventions. And then this is later, this is a piece called Concrete Island, where it's another found space. This is a novel ecosystem. But what's interesting about these plants, this is in Vancouver, Canada, the plants mirror the immigration patterns of the city. So there's native plants, indigenous plants, and there's a sort of other layer of European and Asian flora in there. So in a way, they perfectly mirror the human sort of palimpsest that the city has become. So basically, this was an art piece, but it was found, and I just built stairs, and people looked at the plants. This was some years ago before smartphones, so that's what the little Nokia is. But people would dial a 1-800 number and hear about these plants and how they got there and their ethnobotanical values. So these spaces are very, very important spaces because they aren't controlled, or at least temporarily, they are outside of enclosures. So they open up interesting possibilities for artists and designers. So this is a space that I started with a group of squatters in Vancouver, classic rural space, nutrient poor, used as a dump site, quite toxic. But gradually, my fellow squatters and I, many of them older Chinese senior citizens from Vancouver, which was this area was a very 60% of the people had Cantonese as their original language. So I learned techniques with many of these people who were my mentors, permaculture techniques to change this kind of rural space into a food production space. So that's one thing. This is the kind of guerrilla garden, but this is the kind of thing these spaces, people working with plants, what I call botanical interventions, can afford. And also the species in the rural spaces are much maligned. So this is Scotch broom. Scotch broom is like anybody from that ecosystem. A lot of people will say, oh, this is a noxious plant. It's an invasive weed. But I'm very interested in deconstructing this language. So we actually used Scotch broom as an erosion control device, and it worked great. And then we shaded it out with another kind of tree. So this was the use of succession in these rural spaces as a design strategy. And also using a mix of native and our indigenous and non-indigenous species. This is a tree called Paulownia, very, very fast growing, which was very, very useful in reforesting these urban sites. And so in terms of these, working with disturbed landscapes as an artist, I mean, there's always this, like, what do I do? What do I not do? So on the left is a very disturbed site, obviously. And I worked on this site for some years to revegetate it. But I actually used non-indigenous vegetation to start the process. I used a willow that doesn't grow there. And then eventually the indigenous flora started to move in because of birds bringing it in and wind. So, but I created a scaffold using non-indigenous. So interrogating the indigenous and non-indigenous layers of these sort of novel ecosystems, I find that really interesting as an art practice. So also in terms of the materiality of them, I mean, I talked about styrofoam before. I've been working a lot with plastic lately because it's such a controversial material. And since I am probably part plastic, I've been using insects to degrade plastic. These are mealworms eating styrofoam. I did this with my students at Parsons and they love it. And so I create these little objects. So this is a, obviously a takeout cup that's been partially digested by insects. But I now think that these materials have contemplative status. They're things that we can actually look at as not just waste, but as something that's basically an object of contemplation in the way that philosopher's stones or scholar's stones would. So they really are a kind of symbol of our interconnectedness with the materials that we produce and the processes that degrade them. And I've had little shows in museums of these objects, which is kind of weird because the insects are doing the work, but I kind of valorize them and put them in glass cases, and people like them. And this is a giant stomach where these materials are being digested by insects. So this is something that interests me too, is like we look at these materials as toxic, problematic, and that is the case. But again, they are just food for processes that maybe are beyond us. And the last thing, I think you mentioned about the working with climate change and the horrible realities that we face. I mean, I know Adam will probably talk about this more, but the west coast of Canada is a terrible site for deforestation. So not only is there deforestation, but there's also climate change, right? They're experiencing an incredible heat wave. So some years ago, I decided to take industrial sites that like this that have been deforested and experiment with bringing in prehistorically native trees. So because the climate was a lot hotter during the Eocene 50 million years ago, I thought, why not bring back trees to Canada that were native 50 million years ago, including things like redwoods. And this turned out to actually be prophetically a good idea, even though at the time I didn't know. So in these industrial clear cuts in British Columbia, we're now planting redwoods and sequoias, which are doing very, very well because they're used to hotter heat regimes. And it's ironically and sadly that they're not doing so well in their native, or presently native landscape of Southern California, or actually Northern California. So there are intervention opportunities, but there's sort of a minefield of moral questions, which hopefully we'll get into a little more. This is Rupert Sheldrake and Merlin Sheldrake. I'm sure some of you have heard of Merlin because he's a very well-known mycologist. And I think that's pretty much it. Let me just stop sharing. I hope I haven't exceeded my time.
No, thank you. I think we're all inspired by your work. It's really beautiful. Thank you. And I just want to give Adam and Mendel the opportunity to introduce themselves and their work. I just feel like, their podcast really tells beautiful entangled stories of multiple organisms, human and non-human. And it's really beautiful because they create, on top of that, soundscapes that are kind of, we heard from Alexandra, Bernie Krause, and what those two are doing are literally mixing the geophony, the sound of the earth, with the biophony, with the sound of the living organisms. And then on top of that, the anthropophony, sorry, it's a hard word to say, but the sound of humans. And it's beautiful because they combine so many different trades, but also so many different stories. And so I just want both of them to share a little bit of their journey with us and tell us a little bit about their experience working with ecologies and talking and, introducing people to ecologies.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for having us, Viktoria and Neil. It's really an honor to be here alongside thinkers like Alexandra and Oliver. I know for me personally, Oliver's work is kind of like slow release fertilizer for my thinking. And so it's wonderful to be here speaking with all of you. I hope you all can hear me okay. I live on a small island, and so my internet connection is not great. If it's not coming through clearly, I can stop my video, so just let me know. Yeah, I'll speak for Mendel and I for a moment. So we live here in British Columbia, like Oliver was saying about the coastal forests out here. And, you know, where I live, it's the unceded territory of Coast Salish people, and in specific Penelakut, Hulitsum, Lamalcha, and Lalem Sarataneo people, Hulkaminam speaking people on this territory. And where Mendel lives, it's Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, also Hulkaminam speaking people. I'm thinking today, I want to talk about plants because I love plants, and you guys have all been talking about plants, but I also want to talk just really briefly about what's been happening in Canada in the last couple months, which is that, as many have long suspected, there's been discoveries recently using ground penetrating radar of the bodies of hundreds of Indigenous children outside of residential schools. First out here in British Columbia in Kamloops, and then also as well in Manitoba more recently, potentially over 700 bodies in unmarked graves outside of a residential school there. And the reason I bring this up, I live within a stone's throw of a residential school, one of the most notorious ones on the coast here. And the ecosystems that I work in, I work in restoration ecology when I'm not doing FutureEcologies. They are sort of marked by this absence of what was thousands of years of Indigenous management. And so I know we'll talk about novel ecosystems here in the Anthropocene, but I think, at least anywhere on Turtle Island here in North America, and especially here in British Columbia, where we commonly acknowledge the lands to be unceded, which is sort of just a word for stolen. They were never surrendered in war or through treaty. The ecological novelty here is really that there were, thousands of years, hundreds of generations of Indigenous management here on the coast that touched literally every ecosystem, perhaps with the exception of subalpine ecosystems. And that was removed a very short time ago with the removal of Indigenous bodies from the landscape. And so, a lot of what we do here on the coast is now that we're trying to understand the ecosystems and how they actually work, we're really understanding this huge gap in that human management that is critical and which was unrecognized by earlier settlers, which we're now recognizing. And we're both designers in different ways, Mendel and I, and I think it's very tempting to look at design-based solutions to a problem like the ecological novelty that's been created by that removal. And there are a lot of creative things that people are doing, and I hope we can contribute to that a little bit. But I think that fundamental removal is there, and it's really emphasized by these discoveries recently. And to my mind, there is no substitute, no design-based substitute, no restoration-based substitute to the return of land, to the return of those bodies to the land. And to the ongoing work of trying to heal those wounds, both in the social body, here in Canada, what we call Canada, and also in the ecological body, in the ecosystems, and bringing those things together. So I wanted to speak to that. I know people are tuning in from all over the world, and that's a conversation that's just happening here in Canada, and that I think is starting to affect things elsewhere. But I think it's really important to talk about. And yeah, I know we're on an architecture panel. Mendel and I are architects of nothing except for perhaps sound. And so I'll turn it over to Mendel to speak a little bit about what it is that we do with FutureEcologies and what we're trying to achieve.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Adam. And yeah, thank you to Viktoria and Neil again. And it's such an honor and a privilege to be here alongside Oliver and Alexandra. I actually have the amazing good fortune of living in a neighborhood in Vancouver, which is deeply touched by Oliver's work. I'm just a short distance away from the garden that was being built up in some of those photos, which I'd never seen before. So it's amazing to see how the neighborhood has changed in less than a generation, and it is profound. I guess I'll tell you a little bit more about what we do, which is, as Viktoria mentioned, we made a podcast. We continue to make a podcast, and if you haven't heard it, it's just kind of layers of interviews from various subject matter experts, which we get as deep as we can into any given topic and get fascinated by it and try to meet all the people that we can about it, and try to find some thread that we can pull out of there that essentially every episode we endeavor to challenge some of the assumptions that we find to be commonly held through our social construct of what nature is and how we relate to it, and see if we can pick apart some different ways that through a new appreciation of what nature is and how we are part of it, that, you know, that might engender new behavior. And to respond to what Adam was saying, which I think is a very important articulation, that this concept of sympoiesis is kind of unavoidable in that way, that like, and in the same way that Oliver was talking about, that these rural ecologies, I feel like sympoiesis in different forms of involvement or disinvolvement, of leaving things alone, of co-creation, it's not something that we can actually opt out of in that way, right? To not involve ourselves in spaces is as much an active decision as to involve ourselves in any particular way. That isn't to say that we should equivocate across different kinds of ecosystems in the same way that, like, you know, on the show we talk a lot about kind of relational thinking in terms of the more than human world and kind of trying to build up this sense of kinship. But as you look into that, and I'm going to crib some thoughts from Dr. Max Lieberwein, who I think everybody here should look into. They're amazing. This when you start talking about these kind of relationality of everything and the living world and the things that we may or may not consider to be part of the living world as part of this relational, as you say, the geophony, the geological spaces, the everything is coming together in these moving systems and affecting everything else. And yet it's not a flat network. And I think what's really important to keep in mind is that through these, sorry, I meant to talk about the podcast. I'm talking about the subject. I'll finish the thought. Through decisions and indecisions, we do make allyships, and different organisms in this network of relations have different needs and different incentives, and it's not a flat network where some things create more likelihood for other things to come with them and push out the likelihood for others. And in the case of one of the episodes that we did about jellyfish and how they're sort of dramatically taking over the ocean because in part of climate change and because in part of human anthropogenic development in ocean ecosystems, that it's a profound kind of shift in what's called a trophic level, that there's this whole food chain of kind of energy and metabolism, and as we tip from one to the other, we actually go from this high trophic level where energy is moving quite quickly through the system to this slow trophic level where it's jellyfish and everything's still alive, but it's a radically different system. And as we think deeply about how we are affecting the land and what our possible impacts are, I think we need to recognize that the impact of that decision is making allies with various more than human beings. Anyways, I don't know if you want me to say more about making a podcast. It's we put a lot of music into it, and we put a lot of soundscapes, as you mentioned, and we just try to make it sound good and sense as much as we can. I don't think beyond. I mean, Adam knows a whole lot more about land and restoration than I do, and plants. I'm more of a mushroom person, but really just they're a dabbler. I would say that we really just find things that we're, you know, at a surface level fascinated by, and you know, only try to get a little bit deeper from there. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Mendel. It's funny because we were talking about deep diving yesterday in a different context, but you guys do that with every topic that you tackle, and it's beautiful. So I can only recommend to everyone to listen to FutureEcologies, and I'm really happy that you guys are here. And as Aleksandra said earlier, it's an ongoing conversation. I think all of us are kind of in this big conversation together. As you said, we have to create together and we have to become allies, not only human allies, but non-human allies as well. And just to give a little bit of context for the audience as well, I mean, novel ecosystems are a very debated topic and they're not new. So they're not a 21st century phenomenon, but they have accompanied humans from the beginning of settlements. So they're neither good nor bad, but they need to be discussed. And they also, there shouldn't be an excuse for why we do certain things. But the growth of human population and the increase of international trade and more human expansion has definitely really increased the growth of these novel ecosystems. And it is hard to evaluate and even fathom these, but I think it is very important to make these decisions, as Mendel just said, to kind of start the process of actively engaging and rearranging the existing and really making these decisions together, not alone. And as Alexandra said earlier, to really step back a little bit and not learn from them by extraction, because extraction has been the overall theme, but really by companionship and kinship and starting to learn in a different way. So thank you very much. And I wanted to ask Adam, because I think it's very important to emphasize what he had just contributed. And I think it's very important to kind of think about beyond short-term fixes and kind of go towards a more holistic thinking of healing. And I wanted to say that tomorrow we're actually going to have, and I would like to invite you to join if you can, Sanford Quinter and Bruce Mao will have a session about indigenous cosmology. So I think it is very important and very necessary right now to actually, it is necessary in general, but right now in times like this, I think it is extra necessary to look at that. And so thank you for your contribution. And so maybe there is a way, we heard from Oliver and also from you, Mendel, more kind of like going away from the gloom and doom perspective, but really getting active and getting involved and starting a discussion on a different basis, because the planetary trouble that we're in, maybe we have to move in a more positive direction to actually find kind of ways to interact with it. So I think maybe you can talk a bit about Adam and Mendel. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what reactions of people that you've worked with is and what their perspective is. Is there only gloom and doom, or have you found positive stories and kind of action narratives, or what are some of the kind of experiences that you've had?
Well, I think that the story of novel ecosystems themselves is a positive story. I come to the topic of novel ecosystems through one of my other teachers and mentors, Eric Higgs, who in the field of restoration ecology, along with Hobbes and a couple of other restoration ecologists, articulated this concept of novel ecosystems about a decade ago. And within restoration, I know novel ecosystems is kind of used more broadly for a wider variety of ideas, but within restoration ecology, a novel ecosystem is essentially an ecosystem that is, through human, some kind of human disturbance, to a form that is, biologically and sometimes abiotically unique from what it was before. So, a sharp break from what that ecosystem was historically. But it has two other aspects to it. To be defined as a novel ecosystem, it also needs to be essentially functionally unrestorable, which, in restoration ecology means like no matter how much money and labor you throw at it, you can't return it to what we might perceive as the historical ecological trajectory, or even a historical ecological trajectory, like one of several, right? you can't force that ecosystem back to something that it once was. It is now something all of its own, and it's not going to change, at least not through human intervention. And the final way that we define novel ecosystems in restoration ecology is that they're functional. They're functional ecosystems. So, and you can measure system functionality in all sorts of different ways. Some of them are quite simple. They aren't eroding. They're resisting erosion, right? They have a hydrological flow which ties in with the rest of the ecosystems around them and isn't causing damage. They sequester carbon. They provide complex structure and habitat for native and non-native species. And so, novel ecosystems, and maybe that there's a slight difference between them and hyperecologies. Oliver maybe can speak to that in terms of hyperecologies being sort of developing, budding novel ecosystems perhaps in the making, or also perhaps just highly damaged areas that are in need of some human intervention. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, actually, Oliver. But anyway, in restoration ecology, they are a success story, right? They are ecosystems that don't look like the ones that we sort of historically have expected for those sites, but they are nevertheless functional and self-assembling. And so, I don't view necessarily novel ecosystems as an invitation to intervene as humans because they're ahistorical and therefore, subject to our reinterpretation. I view them as functioning ecosystems that we should watch and learn from. And perhaps in other areas that really are damaged or that need our help, that's where we can apply some of those lessons from both historical and novel ecosystems when we're working with them, ecologically or architecturally, what have you. So that's, I guess, my understanding of the restoration ecology applications for novel ecosystems and how they might apply to this conversation.
Thank you. Oliver, did you want to respond to Adam?
Yeah, well, it's a moving target. It's the movement space of practice versus non-practice. And you could say, in fact, I believe this is that the entire planet is now a novel ecosystem because of climate change, right? So there are long-standing native, or should we say indigenous, or historically indigenous, to even be more specific, species like the sequoia in California that is dying out because of climate change. And that we have to ask ourselves as practitioners, is it right to move them, to save them, which is a completely artificial thing to do and fraught with moral contradictions, which are all valid, or just leave everything alone. So it's this constant dance. And the fact of something is unrestorable is also an interesting question. Like, restorable to what? Are we going to 1492? Or are we going to the First Nations polyculture processes that have gone on since time immemorial, but that landscapes were intensively managed? Those are all states in a flux. So it's a very hard question, and I think it depends on who you ask and what your time frame is and what your metric for success is. I guess in terms of the overarchingness of it, though, my philosophy really is compassion and this feeling of interrelationship, that we are all related on some level at scale and also at the intimate, right? And so can you intervene or not intervene based on compassion and deep awareness of the relationships that you have, going back to your idea of relationality? That's really the driving force, but the devil is in the details. And so, yes, that's a terrible answer, but it's so hard to be clear on this.
Thank you. Yeah, that's I think that's why we're here, because none of these questions that we ask in this workshop are meant to be answered. We want to start a conversation and we want to start thinking about them. And so I think it is very good that we don't have answers, because that would kind of contribute to this short-term fixed, idea again. So I think we are in this together, and I think that is exactly the kind of questions that we need. I mean, we need to ask better questions. So yeah, I think I want to bring Alexandra in. I think you unmuted yourself. Did you want to say something?
I guess maybe question, Oliver in part answered to it, but I always ask myself whether this notion of novel ecology is not really something of a perspective, a temporal perspective that we assume by deciding that just because something arrived in our kind of lifespan and during our presence on this planet, and just because, of course, it's affected so much by the anthropic presence, should we be talking about this as worse or better? Now, of course, various degrees and scales and magnitudes that we need to be looking at, and as you said, it's all about detail. But I wonder what the moment is when that kind of compassion, maybe towards certain specific species that are suffering from the arrival of this novel ecology, would actually justify a certain type of restorative action in order to preserve a habitat, for example. How do we make these decisions? I think those are kind of interesting questions, right? Like, who should we be compassionate towards our own kind of traditional image of something, or towards very specific species that might be suffering from what's going on? And of course, I'm an architect. I don't have answers to that, but I would be really curious to know how you react to those situations.
Gonna take that on, Adam or Mendel? I mean, it is the $1 million question. I think that there's extremes at both ends, right? And for example, now there's a big struggle to save the last old growth forests in British Columbia, and you've probably all seen these articles in The Guardian. These are ancient ecosystems, primary ecosystems, 1,000-year-old trees. And it's worth saving them, right? Even though there is climate change but it's sort of, I think, worth saving them. Going back to the historical injustice of the First Nations being robbed of their land and genocide committed against them. And the ecosystem itself, of which the First Nations are a part. I mean, this is it's even if it's just a relic of the former scale, it's worth saving. Or the Galapagos, worth saving. But there's so many spaces that are not like that, right? And so I think it's not an and/or thing. I think we do need some sort of reference ecosystems, even if they become artificially maintained. I do think there's real value in that, because biodiversity in and of itself, I think it is nice to have 1,000-year-old yellow cedar trees. I do believe that. And but on the other hand, I think there's so much of the earth that's not like that. It's a figure ground relationship. That there's so much biodiversity in the Ruderol. I mean, there's more goshawks at the Tempelhof airport than in northern Finland. Why is that, right? Nobody really knows. It's like an abandoned airport versus subarctic forest. They should be up. There's so many examples where nature is doing strange things that we don't understand, and I think we should celebrate that. But I'm all for saving the what little is left in terms of primary ecosystems, because if we lose it, we'll lose the memory of them, and I think that's very important. The cultural memory, the deep connectedness that generations have had with these ecosystems as cultural memories, but also as sources for biodiversity to out-migrate into the disturbed spaces and potentially do some important healing.
So just to speak to that, yeah, I I agree. There's some really beautiful things that are arising, in this sort of anthropic time in terms of ecological novelty. At the same time, be preserving the old growth forests here on the coast and primary ecosystems everywhere as they still exist. And I would say in terms of in terms of restoration, whether we're coming at it as ecologists or architects or artists, I come back to that decolonial lens of the transformation of North America was not just a removal of indigenous people from the land. It was also basically a whole-scale replacement of the ecosystems that they inhabited and the ecosystems that fed them and their culture and that functioned here previously, right? So you can think of the clearing of the buffalo from the Great Plains. That was part of the colonial project. Their replacement with cows, which has caused all sorts of ecological problems. And now we're let alone trying to replace the buffalo, we're just trying to use cows to kind of mimic the ecological activities that buffalo used to play. That's kind of like the great hope right now, I guess, in grassland ecosystems, whatever is left of them. Out here on the coast, there was just a real, I guess everywhere there was an attempt to take species that were from the places where settlers were coming from, that people were familiar with and that loved, and bring them here and replace native ecosystems with those species. We see that everywhere with species introduction. And it's not to demonize the introduced species. Again, they often form their own unique assemblages and are adopted and naturalize. It's just to say that I think that there is real value in the native ecologies, and not necessarily the native ecologies as they were prior to Columbus or as they were in the 1800s, but just some kind of historical trajectory that these ecosystems, many of them, even the ones that have been disturbed, can still be returned to. Some kind of healthy historical trajectory. And the reason that I think that history is important is because we're really bad system designers and engineers. We're in the early stages of understanding how these systems work. We're just talking about plants a lot today. There's fungus and there's the entire microbiota, and we're just piecing together how this stuff works. And so we're bad at this. That's why it helps to look at sort of the template of what indigenous people were doing for thousands of years and what kinds of ecosystems self-assembled in that these ecosystems are worth preserving. And if we're talking architecturally, like we're building with, right? And not trying to build over, not trying to too quickly embrace their transition into some form of ecological novelty. So, that would be my perspective on that particular topic.
I would actually like to jump off of that, because I mean, being that this is an architecture and design event and panel, and the fact that, like Oliver said, that these rural ecologies actually have a lot of richness. And I love, personally, I find a lot of interest and joy in finding those little treasures in those spaces. And I think that just maybe to get away from kind of the big land management perspective of how are we dealing with whole ecosystems, but when we're talking about the built environment, that most of our, especially modern built environment, is way more ecologically depressed than these post-industrial landscapes. I mean, toxicity aside, like there's a lot going on there, and versus what's happening in most of our homes, in most of our office spaces. And I guess my challenge to the architecture and design community would be to realize that, new projects that might be showcase projects might have their value in terms of leading the design priorities and pushing forward the R&D of what's possible, and saying like, this is a big superstar project, and this makes it like everybody can look to this and say, oh, we'll do a little bit of that and a little bit of this. But if you're relying on new construction to accomplish that, you are only chipping away at a little bit at a time, and it's going to take us a very long time to really remediate where we spend the most time. Most of us spend the most time. And I think that I would be very, very interested to see ways of encouraging these self-assemblages to take place in a renovatory way, and using the environment that's already there and seeing what we can structure onto it. In the Alexandra that you said, like plants are verboten, right? Like on buildings in these ways, but like maybe there's a way around the edges with mosses and with like the cyanobacteria that Oliver pointed out. So like we start stepping up towards other things joining in, and along that path, we haven't had to tear down these buildings and landfill them, but we are changing our social priorities of what we expect a built environment to look like. And I think that could be a really exciting thing, right? That then it changes what we demand, and also what we perceive as, like Viktoria, as you mentioned, like our self-inflicted kind of boundary between nature and urbanity. But really it's all habitat, right? We've got raccoons, we've got skunks, we've got pigeons, we've got everything, we've got goshawks in the airport. It's just about like expanding the possibilities for more things to join into that assemblage. It would be really interesting to me.
Can I just pick up? Is it possible to pick up on that and just ask a question? I mean, first of all, thanks for these contributions. Really wonderful. Very, very. I'm no expert on this, and really, I respect the work you're doing, and I've got a very naive question, and maybe naive questions are kind of useful sometimes. So yesterday we were talking about membranes and boundaries. We had a discussion about outer space, and Barbara Imhoff was telling us there's a 5 millimeter boundary between the astronaut and the deadly outer space. So the whole discussion was about boundaries. And one of my kind of preoccupations as someone trained in architecture is, what the hell is architecture, and where do we define the boundaries of architecture? And I think it's really a challenging thing, because and there is a tendency to embrace everything, but then where is architecture? So you get lost in the situation. You need to define in some ways what it is. So I'm intrigued by the role of, let's say, the preposition here, in terms of what is the preposition that is kind of in a sense between us and nature, in a sense, because the term, I've made in a couple of notes of some of the kind of terms that have been used, like alongside and so on, but But I mean, from my naive perspective, we are part of nature. So how do we? What is the preposition that we use in talking about this? If ecological systems are invading buildings, and if plastic is part of who we are, and styrofoam and goodness what else, what is the preposition that we should use? I mean, is there one, or does it? I mean, I don't know. Let me just throw that out there. I've got no idea. I don't know whether Alexandra, you want to sort of talk about this. Maybe it's a.
Okay, so Neil, just one question to clarify. When you say proposition,
Preposition, so like in, of, and, alongside.
oh, okay, in terms of in relation to nature, right?
Yeah.
Okay, now I understand. I was just worried that I was misunderstanding. Well, for me, we are of nature. That means, as you said, we're part of nature. But I do, as much as I constantly talk to my students mainly about expanding the boundaries and thinking in systems terms and cybernetic terms and you name it, and really being careful about how we set up the boundaries. And I at the same time have to say that I think we need to at some point also acknowledge the fact that we are on a certain technological path that is really difficult to leave, right? We're in a groove. We could say, like in a crowd, a groove that we dug for ourselves, and it's very difficult to kind of jump out of it. And very often, when we talk about this incredible wisdom that we lost, the indigenous wisdom, I ask myself whether at the scale of and nature of our technologies could ever allow us to actually absorb those wisdoms again to a degree that would be successful in the sense that would reinstall some kind of an ecological balance. And sometimes, I think about statements that are very provocative when people say, well, maybe if we all move to places like Manhattan and just accepted that architecture is about hardcore boundaries and it's a cultural construct, and we failed to kind of create that natural, seamless transition between what's non-human and human nature, that would allow us to kind of preserve space for other species. Someone else, like for example, Stuart Pym, ecologist Stuart Pym, once, half jokingly, I suppose, he said, well, if everyone moved to Canada, sorry, Canadians on the panel, because the biodiversity is so low there, we would be able to actually save the biodiversity hotspots, right? So I ask myself whether sometimes it's not about one solution or another. It's definitely, to me, like the statement I think Oliver said, leave them alone. Leave them alone at different scales, to me, is really, really important. And I struggle with the idea of conservation, but I also do believe that we are at a place in our, we are in a situation where we should be embracing all solutions, all possible solutions. Now, I think I totally kind of went on a tangent and not really answered Neil's question, but so I'm going to try to go back to it for a moment. I do believe that we are in a situation where we do not have the luxury of just being architects who deal with cultural issues of autonomous kind of discourses that are limited to what we know best and what we love to do, which is space making, which is form making, because of the situation in which we find ourselves. But at the same time, I don't think that it's possible to just say, well, let's delete the way we do things and now embrace the indigenous knowledge, because we do not have access to it at the scales at which we operate. I think we will fail if we only do that. Now, I have no answers to that, of course, but I think knowing that we are in this really strange situation is very important.
Yeah, I guess my question would be, it's kind of like, in a way, it relates, I think, to your question about conservation. I mean, where do you put the point at which you intervene in terms of conservation? And I guess since you spent some time in England, there's a where I was brought up in Sussex, there's a place called Burling Gap that's been eroded by the ocean. The question is, do you stop the ocean? Do you kind of put a barrier up there and artificially prevent it from eroding the cliffs, or do you just let it happen and say, well, that's what it is? And if you took that to an extreme degree, you would be saying, well, human beings are kind of like doing this thing, and that's what they're doing, and you just step back and let things happen, which is obviously maybe is not as detrimental in terms of biodiversity and all these other things. But it's kind of interesting to know how you define boundaries, and how do you put a limit on things? Where do you start at what level and so on? It becomes a kind of interesting kind of question because, well, anyway, I just want to throw that out there because I struggle with this question myself in understanding all sorts of boundaries. I mean, I'm all for, just in terms of architecture, I'm not saying that that's an issue at all, but I'm all for opening up architecture. But when architecture becomes everywhere, architecture is nowhere. I think you know that book that came out of the GST that Marika Trotter published.
Sure. Yeah, but I think it's just to finish, what you mentioned about the erosion of the coast. Well, this is an erosion that is definitely not, well, at least probably what you're talking about, not of anthropic nature, but us encroaching on the Amazon forest to extract resources to build buildings. That is really a matter that architects should be dealing with, I believe. And I know it's a lot to kind of absorb into the boundaries or kind of welcome within the boundaries of what we consider our field. But I just don't think we have a choice anymore at this historical moment not to deal with it. And maybe that will make us worse architects, worse than Borromini and you name it, because they didn't have to deal with that. But I think we have to.
Well, I mean, I agree. I mean, I was actually responsible for setting up a discussion we had on the Amazon rainforest, and I do think that we should be aware of those things. I guess this preposition thing always leaves me kind of confused. I never quite know where to situate myself. But anyway, thank you, Alexandra.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in with the preposition? I mean, going back to the idea of there, no separation between the self and other. We are in nature, but also that I'm not an architect, but I enjoy buildings. But the idea of enclosure. And I think one of the issues is, by creating these enclosed spaces, I mean, we obviously need shelter and stuff, but there's also capitalism. And one of the things that's really driving it is the constant enclosure of non-capitalized spaces, either through the built environment or through property. And what you find because architecture really is everywhere, as soon as you leave a space unenclosed, like if there's like in New York, for example, in East Village, there was the period in the 70s when all there was this abandonment. People moved into these vacant spaces, which were temporarily unenclosed. They were not owned by anyone. They were the commons, and built structures. They built incredible structures. They built communities. People can create alternatives to the capitalist forms of enclosure. And the thing that's driving the biodiversity crisis is the enclosure, in the sort of Marxian sense, due to capitalism. And architecture, there's people who are allowed in the spaces and people who are not allowed in the spaces. And in America, that's reached its extreme, given homelessness. But if you allow open source landscapes, if you allow landscapes where people can kind of reconfigure and reassemble outside of the strictures of property, you have a very kind of different types of a set of things that happens. Now, these spaces are very rare because, I mean, as we all know, in New York, things have gotten gentrified. It's really hard to do this now. My days as a squatter in Vancouver, that's just not a thing that happens, right? Because the property that we took over in the early 90s is now worth multiple millions of dollars, right? So there's just too much pressure from capitalism. But capitalism is the pollutant. It's the thing that's driving us into this unsustainable, and enclosure in the broad sense, be it buildings or be it property, is one of the drivers of all of the suffering. So in nature, and we are nature. So there's a lot of ways of looking at that prepositional question.
Thank you. That actually leads me to maybe invite Mohammed, who actually had a question for you about it. I wanted to share it with the entire panel. Oliver, I know you answered it already on the chat, but maybe if Mohammed, if you are here, do you want to unmute yourself and share your video with us and ask your question?
I think yesterday we found out that Mohammed's video doesn't work very well. But
he's not here.
Hello everyone. I cannot share my video because my webcam is something wrong with it. Oliver mentioned something about open source landscape. A question comes to my mind that what is an open source landscape? But because I think of landscape as it is open source. Everyone can access it, everyone can modify it, anyone can build in it. But Oliver answered me as property and dynamics of enclosure. Open source landscape is temporarily liberated from enclosure, allowing other processes to proceed. And he mentions, he said, he mentioned some examples of NYC community gardens of NYC. I think another example for that I can that it reminds me is some tents of nomad people. Maybe I don't know. That's another kind of example of open source landscape. They are free of any enclosure, but they are related maybe to a space. They are related to architecture. I don't know. That's just an idea that comes to my mind. And Oliver, I think Oliver gave me a very good, great answer to my question. What's the difference between open source and open source landscape and ordinary, or maybe that just landscape? Thank you.
Thank you. Oliver, did you want to add something to it? Or Alexandra, yes, please.
No, I just have a question comes to my mind, whether when we think about open source landscapes and allowing the equal access to the commons, can we trust that we still have the intelligence and wisdom that we kind of assume the indigenous people had to use these resources in a responsible way? I sometimes wonder whether we're not at that point where, unfortunately, a certain degree of command and control is inevitable. But of course, the one that Oliver is talking about is a whole different story. I just wanted to throw this in, maybe as a devil's advocate.
That's the supreme question, and it's refreshingly. I mean, I'm a misanthrope, so this is a big deal for me to actually admit that people mostly do the right thing. And it's interesting. I've been involved in so many of these movements, but if you take the property out of it, if you take the capitalism out of it, like there was no value, there was no commercial value in these landscapes, right? So if people can just, this notion of usufruct, that people can use landscapes in a sort of subsistence way, you don't necessarily get the tragedy of the commons. People self-organize and come up with, protocols for sharing, right? And even if this can happen in America, but it tends to happen amongst low-income people who've already been marginalized by capitalism. And this is what happened in Vancouver as well. They were the poorest neighborhood in Canada where we did this, right? So those folks are already marginalized, and they realize there have to be alternatives to capitalist enclosure. Where it gets difficult is now when there's so much pressure from capitalism on these unenclosed sites to somehow commodify them, and that urban planners have a lot of to blame. They have, by over controlling these landscapes, they take away the sort of generative sort of spontaneity of these landscapes, and even the mistakes. I mean, somebody might want to stick up pink flamingos or, get some old car seats and sit around a garbage fire, right? Now that's the way community gardens used to be, but now it's like, oh no, that doesn't look good. that goes against the sort of park aesthetic, which is all about class and sort of Eurocentrism. But the ugly head of commerciality and gentrification changes these spaces very, very quickly, and also changes the sort of composition of them, culturally and stuff. So by leaving things alone, I mean, I would say in most cases, if you take capitalism out of the equation, at least temporarily, you'll get an interesting result. Mostly it works. I mean, sometimes it fails, but most of my experience has been, yeah, kind of people who wouldn't ordinarily talk start to talk, and they come up with this understanding that somehow works, you know, in a kind of hapless and kind of incremental way, but it does work. That's my feeling.
Can I speak to this really quickly? Yeah, I was thinking about the idea of the membrane, and I also agree that this idea. I'm a student of sort of various forms of commonsing. I guess I was thinking back to Gustavo Esteva and his idea, you know, of the very many different kinds of commons, and that commonsing is sort of like a verb, right? It's something that we do. It's a practice, and so many of us are not very good at practicing it. I've experienced this working in a number of community garden or community forest garden settings, and you know, some people are good at commonsing and other people are really not very good at commonsing yet, and you know, there's lots of societal incentives that would push us towards not being good at commonsing under this kind of capitalist regime. I was thinking about these kinds of, I've been cleaning up, so like I said, I work on Galiano Island, and one of the large sort of conservation areas that we have is kind of an experimental site for ecosystem restoration of all sorts of kinds. And so we do things that could be described as novel ecosystems or bioengineering. We also do sort of more traditional kinds of restoration. And for about 50 years, you know, from the 1960s to the early 2000s, the owner of this property, the prior owner, allowed people to squat there. And so I have neighbors on Galiano Island who are actually born on this property, in these little like provisional buildings that were assembled in that time. And it's kind of a cool human legacy. And, you know, I'm really glad that it happened. Unfortunately, it's also like all of those structures are made of materials that are, you know, they are structures that were never built to be persistent in the landscape, right? They were built for, you know, a short period of time by people who were building them just vernacularly with whatever. And, you know, they're built with materials, many of which are persistent for potentially thousands of years, notwithstanding mealworms' ability to digest styrofoam. You know, a lot of these materials, fiberglass, insulation, and, you know, there's all sorts of junk that I pull. So I've been deconstructing these buildings, right? Trying to restore some of these ecosystems and taking these buildings apart and thinking about how, you know, how these sort of property relations mediate different forms of building, and how the materials that we have, you know, either allow or disallow this kind of vernacular architecture to be ecological in nature, right? And so, you know, I think there's a lot of promise in the sort of practices of commonsing and of allowing less of a command and control model to this kind of stuff. But I think that the materials that we use architecturally have to. I like the idea of buildings as slow release fertilizer, but buildings, many of these structures are also just like extremely hazardous for people and for the natural world. And so I do think like we have to have a sort of materials revolution to allow that sort of vision to happen. Otherwise, I think, you know, we do have to be much more careful. And maybe in urban areas where, you know, the ecosystem has already been fundamentally destroyed, we can really have these experiments. I work in a rural area where, again, you know, there's less and less intact ecosystems, and the ones that we are moving into and bringing these materials and practices into, we need to think, I think, a little bit more carefully about. So, you know, there's an urban rural split there as well. But I'm not an architect. My challenge would be that we need materials that we can work with that will, you know, that are suitable to the actual time span of the structures that we're creating for ourselves. Like the long houses here on the coast, built of massive Western red cedar, you know, incredible architectural designs for the period and the people that were living in them. And they're mostly gone now. You know, they've become part of the ecosystem again. So
to add briefly to this discussion, which I think is, I mean, Adam brought it back to architecture. I'm going to take it a little bit back outside when we talk about command and control versus, you know, anarchy and all of its beauty and chaos and potential conflict versus, you know, potentially oppression and authoritarianism, and kind of unilateral viewpoints of how the world should be. hope and I believe that there is a middle ground which is being achieved through a lot of these projects quite naturally, but that you know, with time, I don't know if there is a way to really jumpstart this, but with time, I think I don't want to say that I'm, you know, in any way an expert on governance or, you know, indigenous governance in all of its very many forms, but that like it makes sense to me when you have when we start to find consensus based on areas that I think are smaller than cities perhaps, or definitely nation states, where we entrust certain people with a focus, right? And we look to them to tell us what their interpretation of what a path forward is within their avenue, within the part of the focus of the world that they're looking at. And we create councils of people that know what a little bit about this and a little bit about that, rather than everybody, singular individuals doing whatever they want, wherever they want. And rather than like a structured government that tells everybody what to do, that there's a bit of a push and a pull, but it is between people who have cultivated themselves and their community as experts in one thing or another. And I think if we start to play with the size of those areas that we're talking about, and it might just be a garden, it might be a watershed, that, and of course, figuring out systems of trust and consensus goes along with that, another technological challenge that we have ahead of us. I believe in a middle path like that. That's all I wanted to add.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really interesting. When you were talking about the organizational part of it, I think it's also that I think Alexandra, you mentioned that at some point that architecture is still hesitant to actually really dive deep into the temporal aspect of architecture and really designing with time and over time and creating these systems. I mean, I really like the idea of architecture as fertilizer almost, because it is part of the landscape. You know, it's coming out of it. It's not that it's kind of excluding itself from it, and it's creating these like very, you know, it's there over time. And I think that's one of the aspects that personally for me is very important, to kind of shift that focus and kind of bring that into the focus of architecture, the temporality of it. I mean, I would love to get Sanford on board here, but he'll take a moment, but he would have a lot to say about it, I think. And maybe Alexandra can chime in for a second.
Hi there. You know, I'm here still on phone, but I'll get connected. I'll be there via computer in about 5 minutes. How's that?
Okay, awesome.
Okay, so I can fill the 5 minutes. I was thinking as well, Viktoria, you mentioned time, which is a little bit about embracing the flexibility or the unpredictability of time-based processes, which is one aspect that I kind of want to keep in mind for a moment. But also Mendel was talking about governance and all sorts of ways in which we organize ourselves in order to face problems and come up with solutions, right? And find compromises. And I want to go back for a moment to the topic of actually my dissertation, which many people are very surprised that I actually decided to spend 4 years studying building codes and incentives. That I decided no one does it, and it was a bit of a Kafka experiment that, you know, digging into that. But why I mentioned that is that I think those are areas that are of fundamental importance to architecture, and they're overlooked, and they're almost a kind of subset of what Bateson called mental ecologies. And I know that, of course, he intended it in a really broad way. But when I started looking at the systems of, you know, standards and regulations and codes that we write, I just realized that those are those really, decisions that are, or ways of doing things that are written in black and white and are really difficult to change, even if you have the best governance local at any level, you know, you name it. But they actually really make us into that rigid acrobats on the wire that Bateson talks about, that, you know, it's just not allowed to have the flexibility that is necessary to stay on the wire, because every single movement he makes is fully codified and standardized. And to me, what we have done, especially, and I was shocked when I moved to the US, how incredibly standardized the construction systems are and building processes are, is that we actually have pushed our systems to a point where we are prisoners of these systems. And very often we are not even allowed to use certain solutions that people used in the past. And I'll give you just one really common example, that for a long time it was impossible to build with straw bale, which in places like what Adam mentioned it's exactly what we need, right? When you really don't want to bring toxic materials. I mean, you don't want to bring them anywhere, but especially in those places. So why you are not able to use them unless you are on indigenous lands that have their own building codes is because we were not normalized and codified in the building code. So it took someone like Martin Hammer, who basically spent years coming up with a model code so that we can actually use them to a certain degree. And now I know all of this is kind of boring but I really think that we need to be looking at that, and we need to be dismantling those. We need to be making them, and we need to realize that these things also have a temporal scale and temporal life, that although it's incredibly slow, it does change, and architects could be part of it to some degree. And it is a weapon that we should be using. A very difficult one to use because it's incredibly controlled by all sorts of lobbies and organizations, of course, and people who protect their liability. But I don't think we should be overlooking that as an issue.
Can I raise, well, before someone, Sanford doesn't, until Sanford's here, another question, which is, in a way, when we talk about landscape, it's kind of interesting. What do we mean by landscape? And I for a while, I was very close to the Netherlands, living very close there. And really, there's hardly anything in the Netherlands that's not kind of the landscape, as we call it, that's not manufactured in or some way or controlled or by human beings. And I just wonder, I mean, alongside the kind of the technical kind of control, shall we say, the way in which we define things in very human terms. In other words, we define what is kind of good and bad. I'm thinking here in California, we have these hummingbirds, which look cute, right? But they're incredibly territorial, right? And back in the UK, we have these squirrels. We love squirrels, but what is the difference between a squirrel and a rat? And at what point do we open up to things? I mean, if we get our homes get infested with mites or I don't know, insects or things, we see that as a bad thing. So where do we, is there not a danger of kind of a human judgment coming in everywhere here and defining what is good and what is bad?
I mean, I think this goes back to what I brought up initially about allyships and saying that we are okay with these pets and creatures in our house, and up to a point, insects maybe are beyond the pale. I don't have an answer to that. I think it's just a human tendency to treat certain things as charismatic. Of course, we've been talking about plants a lot, and we haven't been talking as much about bacteria, right? Just because they're not as much in our day-to-day, and we don't treat them as, or rather, like most plants, we don't consider as carriers of disease or have built up these social connotations about it. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. I think one of the things that touches on what Alexandra was saying in building codes, and I'm sure that these things were developed with the best of intentions in terms of liability, which comes to predictability of materials and predictability of results and engineering and these things. So like, it strikes me that there's a balance to be had between, allowing for certain experiments to take place and, not having an unacceptable degree of risk where we talk about lives of humans and other creatures, like ecological risk as well. But I think it's interesting when we talk about scale. My mom is an architect, and I'm going to butcher an anecdote here that she told me when I was young, so forgive me if this isn't totally accurate, but my perception was it was something to do with the vapor barrier codes here in Vancouver and how they were designed with a much broader kind of regional understanding of vapor transport across buildings, and that the code as written was actually totally inappropriate for the place where we were. And because of the scale of how that code was written, if there was still a building code, but it was just a little bit zoomed in, it might have been better, but functionally it was actually counterproductive for what the intent of the code is. So yeah, I think it's going to take a lot of work to pull back from that. I guess like the whole title of the talk is living in our filth, right? Like, do we accept a certain degree of other creatures in our living spaces? Or is that the reason we started building buildings and enclosing spaces in the first place, is to kind of insulate ourselves from the cold and from these other presences? and how much personally, socially are we going to kind of release that if we even want to?
Well, maybe I should even propose the provocative question: what do we mean by filth? I mean, that is already got some kind of judgment, right? In implicit in the term.
Yeah.
I have a brief answer to that about filth. So living in our own filth, I know I'm going to come back to sort of the indigenous landscape here, and that's just, you know, I don't speak for indigenous people at all, but I am a student of the landscape, and therefore a student of indigenous practices here on the land in coastal British Columbia. But you know, so we have these areas. They're called middens, and I think Oliver refers to them in the podcast episode we did with him, because you know, middens are sort of, they're not quite the equivalent of landfill. Middens also contain human remains. So, you know, I think that, and maybe that speaks to a difference between, you know, the way that we as settlers have lived on the land and the way that indigenous people inhabited the land and still inhabit the land out here on the coast, is that, you know, the middens that they created on the coast are incredibly persistent landscapes that actually completely transform the ecosystems that exist on them. You know, they take what would otherwise just be kind of coniferous forest here, and they create an extremely rich landscape filled with all sorts of species that don't occur very commonly. And so you'll enter a midden site and you immediately know it, because the soil goes from being this kind of like brownish, orange, leached color to this rich, dark black color, filled with shells and all sorts of interesting things like tools and old animal remains, and also occasionally human remains. And so, you know, I guess the way that, you know, we could look at it is that middens are kind of filth, right? Living in our own filth. In many ways, indigenous people were living on the filth. They were using middens as a way to extend the land, or they would go to areas that were really, you know, great lookout places and great hunting and harvesting places, and then they just build land there. They'd build that land by hundreds of years of accretion of waste of all sorts of different kinds. But as I said, there's often human remains in these places, and so I think the view towards what that waste was and what it meant is different. You know, we wouldn't generally try to bury our parents or relatives in landfill. And so, you know, that kind of relationship with waste and place and how that relates to the ecology around, I think is really unique and something that we can learn from. And right now we're trying to preserve those. I mean, essentially people on the coast are trying to preserve those sites because they're eroding. They're often close to the shoreline. They're eroding away. And so you see sometimes these like big armored, you know, rock or log structures that are trying to hold those middens up to the sea because they're an aspect of cultural and archaeological heritage or something like that. But the only real way to keep a midden from eroding away is to continue building it, is to continue the practices that created it and led to its creation in the first place. And so I don't know, I doubt that we're going to be trying to like preserve our modern landfills again, which are largely filled with the debris of past buildings, persistent materials that, you know, are never going to break down, at least in any kind of reasonable time frame, and are places that we generally don't want to be. We don't want to live on, in, or near them. And so, you know, for me, having a society and a building practice that is closer to the sort of midden that we have on the coast, that produces that kind of, you know, we want, not only do we live in or near our filth, but we want to be there because it's a generative landscape. I think that there's something really, you know, profound about that difference, and that's what I would, you know, like to see us moving towards personally.
Yeah, the filth versus food kind of dialectic is really interesting, because, you know, our filth is food for other organisms, and again, there's no separation between our filth and the rest of the world. So I mean, we're all, you know, born from filth and will return to filth. But this question of material ethics, I think, is because I work at a place where that's a very big conversation dealing with, you know, everything from packaging to architecture. How do we not, you know, create these persistent damaging materials, and how do we live with nature while still maintaining a sort of, it's nice not to have mosquitoes in your house. It's not nice to have like, body lice. It's not nice to have, it's nice to be warm, in the winter and cool in the summer. So these are all things that most people agree on, I think. But there is such a lively effort now amongst architects. And I just put some things in the chat. I was at an astonishing talk a few years ago at the Storefront for Art and Architecture, where people were designing bacteria-friendly, cyanobacteria-friendly panels for buildings to make the building's habitat, to basically create a being with, not, us or them, right? So the idea that the bacteria become part of the building and they're actually doing useful things like absorbing pollution and giving off oxygen. And then, Terraform did that famous monarch butterfly piece in New York. And so it is an active area of discussion, like the built environment, how can the envelope kind of be an affordance for the non-human? And I think I'm glad to see my various colleagues really diving into this from a microbiome level to right on to like, big plants hanging off the side of buildings that are places for butterflies to live. So it's an ongoing question, but the building codes are a big issue. I have a colleague in Portland, Oregon, Mark Lakeman, who some of you might know, he's an architect. They're actively trying to rewrite the building code there to allow things like cob and straw slip and straw bale and they've actually done the math, like how many inches or centimeters of cob is equivalent to a conventional stud wall with big fiberglass. So they're doing that bit by bit. And so now certain cities they have a kind of, quantitative substitution process by where you could say, I don't want to use pink fiberglass, I want to use straw. How much do I need to have it be fireproof and have it give the same R value? So it is happening, and I'm really glad of that. I've ragged on architects the odd time in my life, but I take it all back because there's some really good people out there doing great work.
Thank you. Neil?
I just want to say to Alexandra, I think actually that's a great topic for a PhD to do work on those kind of questions, the constraints that are implicit in building codes. But I think there's also, which are kind of explicit, right? They're down there in code. But I think there's also a whole series of other things to do with implicit kind of, things that are in place, shall we say. And one of the examples I'm thinking of yesterday, I was talking to one of our PhD students in Digital Futures, Tongji, and he's in Dubai, and the Burj Khalifa, which is of course the tallest building ever made, is made out of sand that comes from Australia. And UAE, of course, is a land full of sand, but they can't use that sand, so they fly it. And of course, that is kind of environmentally and from all sorts of angles is clearly wrong, But the point that I was trying to make to him is that it's not just simply you kind of showing, and there are some experiments now to how you can use desert sand and find novel ways of bonding so you can make concrete out of it and so on and so on and so on. But there are other kind of, I think, structures in place, which is to say, kind of inscribed within kind of the constructional industry itself that will prevent that ever becoming kind of mainstream. It's just the way that people do things. And I remember once I was working with an engineer who developed a software program for a performance-based software program. And I said, it was very experimental. I said, it would be great to get something built with that. And they said, well, yes, but it's impossible. It's impossible to really break into the kind of corporate world. If you're if you've got an engineer, you've got to be Arab. You've got to have a name behind you or something like that to be able to kind of break down those kind of structures. So I'd say that there are other forms of structures which sound kind of boring, but actually I think they're incredibly interesting in terms of how certain forms of practice are excluded by kind of implicit kind of accepted ways of operating.
Yeah. Absolutely, I agree. I think they're all incredibly interconnected, where certain codes support this kind of structures that are unwritten, but there are also cultural issues that are written into them. And like one of them is the fact that, whenever you read the word toilet in the codes, it's a water toilet, which basically just by using this word prevents you from dealing in a more ecological way, you could say, with our own filth, right? With how we actually deal with excreta and urine that are not even named by words anywhere, which means that you cannot use them as a fertilizer. So, but what would it take to underdo hundreds of years of, or hundreds of years at least, of sewage, urban sewage? Well, it's not just about the code, of course. It's an incredible system of that has a momentum, to use Hughes' term, that is just so incredible that it's hard to kind of touch it.
Very interesting. Yeah, they actually just installed biodegradable toilets in Prospect Park over here in Brooklyn, and I was surprised by that because, you know, I mean, it's rare to see, and I can understand that they can do it in a park. But yeah, you're so right. I think that's part of the issue is these inherited biases that are just getting inscribed, and I mean that's why we're all here. I think because it's really beginning with thinking differently and kind of starting to kind of detect your own biases in a way and start getting a notion of your own kind of little pockets that we fall into in terms of thinking about certain things in certain ways. So yeah, I'm very, very glad that you're all here. And since Sanford was able to join us with video too now, I wanted to give him the opportunity to comment or join us in our conversation.
Sanford's muted. Okay.
No, I'm back. Sorry, guys. Listen, first of all, let me say that the intermittency with which I was able to stay tuned in over the last couple of hours has prevented me from being able to really responsibly or appropriately comment. I've been, but I do have some things to say here just in terms of astonishment and gratitude. I understand this series is still being called Sanford Quinter and His Friends, and certainly I include strongly Alexandra and Viktoria as my friends, but I can't believe this wonderful conversation, this wonderfully cosmopolitan conversation that they have set up. I want to be able to say one day that Kellhammer, Huggins, and Solsky are also my friends. I've got to figure out a way to make that happen. Because I think it's incredibly important that the discourse boundaries erode. Now, I will say a couple of things here. I can hear it in the comments that there are histories of engagement with all three of the respective disciplines and practices represented by Kellhammer, Huggins, and Solsky, in which their engagements have not been entirely satisfactory. With architecture, with design, whatever it happens to be, landscape, ecologic, well, whatever. I have to say that you must not attribute any of those barriers to anything that cannot be changed. Why? Because they're nothing but inherited, defensive, inherited biases with architects are so unaware of, they don't even know how to maintain them. That's my personal belief, is that we are today involved in a practice of tearing down walls which are so weak. You know, it's like the three little piggies, you know, a little bit of hard breathing and the shit will come down if you know how to breathe. So, well, that's something I feel like this event today is such a wonderful thing, because I think in a way it probably, I don't know for sure, but it probably came a long way to begin to normalize a conversation, shall we say. So there were a lot of individual things that struck me as, you know, things I would want to respond to, but nothing right now, I think, appropriate given the direction of the conversation. How much time is there, if I may ask? You're close to the end?
We have maybe about another half an hour, I guess.
Yeah, we can stay on. I was also going to involve some questions from the audience, but we do have time. Yes.
I would say just 10 minutes at the end, but for something else. But yes.
I would like to, well, let me just say one thing that's on my mind. If you're waiting for people to throw in questions, I don't know exactly how well, first of all, let me first declare to the Canadians on the panel that I'm Canadian as well. Though I've lost a lot of my connection to Canada, I'm also rediscovering it in many ways right now. But tomorrow, we're having a session which is going to try to address whatever the word indigeneity might represent as a hope, a destination, a promise, and so forth, with a certain humility, because honestly, I'm very aware of the difficulty of treading on that area. But I would like to say I've invited two Canadians, two really impressive Canadians in many ways, to participate in our session. That is the designer Bruce Mao, who is affiliated with the Laurentian School of Architecture, which is the first trilingual or tricultural design institution probably in the world, but certainly in North America, and which includes native culture, languages, etc., in addition to the French and the English. And then a wonderful Métis designer and thinker from Canada. I'm inviting you guys. This is what I'm saying is I'm inviting you guys if you'd like to come in. I don't know where exactly we are going to go, except that I personally have always had an guilt-ridden, deep interest in all things pre-modern, prehistoric, indigenous, and generally non-Western, because of the illumination, or generally the revelation, shall we say, to which they can contribute to many tendencies which I've spent the last 35, 40 years studying in so-called the Western philosophical tradition. In other words, I do see that the best parts, shall we say, of Western philosophical tradition engage, let's just say, rub up very hard on the boundary of thinking which comes from outside of it, and which opens the door very widely, or I've always felt it had. Anyway, I would like to say that we need your guidance. We really do need it to help us understand what kind of future integration is possible and even is appropriate given some of the preposterous, shall we say, limits on engagement and thought and speech which are erupting around us today. I hope you understood the dog whistle in a lot of that language. And I just want to tell you guys, I want to be, I want to hold hands. I want to jump out of the airplane with you guys. And that's all I want to say for now. And I really think that the cross-border engagement is going to be very important, because the Canadians are several steps ahead already, even though, of course, recent discoveries have told us just how horrific the Canadian context has been and could still be, etc.
Can I just quickly say something? It seems like we don't have as much time as I thought we had. Apparently, there's another session which is on inclusivity. We want to include inclusivity that needs to use the live stream. So I think we're going to have to wrap things up at this moment, which is a bit of a shame because there was something I wanted to add at the very end. We'll have to find another time for that. My apologies for this. It wasn't happening yesterday and we were okay yesterday to go on, but today they have another session that's going on and we need to kind of leave space for them. So maybe I could just ask Viktoria maybe to just say very briefly to wind up the session.
Yes, I guess thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Neil, for giving it over to me. I mean, what we saw today is that this is a long discussion and we've come up with even more questions than we have answers for, and answers are not the goal of this entire workshop anyways. It's about questions and pushing boundaries. And so I thank you everyone for participating. I'm really thankful that you could all make it, especially Mendel and Adam that woke up very early for us. So thank you. And Stanford, thank you for joining us. Oliver, of course, for sharing much of your work. Thank you very much. And this is to be continued. So if you want to, please join us tomorrow. It's going to be under the same Zoom link that you have. So you are very welcome to join. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
guys. It was
Thank you,
fantastic.
everyone.
Thanks so much.
Good to see all of you.
Yeah. Bye. Take care.